Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm going to stand up. I'm only 5'8½", so you probably won't be able to see me at the back unless I stand up. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. This is a topic, an area that the IEA has investigated in some depth, at some length, and some of our critics would say with some degree of repetition over the past couple of years, but that has not daunted us at all from continuing to debate and discuss one of the key topics facing the UK today, and if anything, a topic that's going to grow in salience, I think, over the next year or two. Namely, what should our relationship be with the European Union, if any? And if there is to be no relationship, what new relationships should we forge? And of course, the EU touches on us in a wide range of ways in our life, some of them relatively trivial, some of them really significant, like the regulation of e-cigarettes, for example. But we decided at the IEA that the way we wanted to look at this was not so much be a part of the sort of cost-benefit analysis. Should we be in? Should we be out? What would be the four things you would renegotiate if you could pick any four? But rather to try and address the question, if Britain were to leave, what is the blueprint for a free and prosperous Britain on the outside? What should we do if there is a Brexit from the European Union? And to that end, last year we ran our Brexit competition, in which we encouraged people to put forward their blueprint and awarded a €100,000 prize to the winner of that competition to give the best blueprint for a free trading, prosperous UK outside of the European Union. The IEA doesn't take a corporate position on whether we should be in or whether we should be out, but we do take a view that if we're to be in or to be out, we want to be as free market and free trading as possible. And therefore we think it's well worth exploring the possible out routes. So following our Brexit competition, which was intriguingly enough won by a Foreign Office diplomat, a chap called Ian Mansfield, who since winning his prize I think is now being locked in a dungeon by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who have attempted to prevent him speaking such blasphemy again. But along with Ian and a range of other contributors, indeed new authors, we are tomorrow releasing this new IEA publication, Brexit, Directions for Britain Outside of the EU. A range of different options about how we think we could pursue the world outside. Now I have to say that the IEA, as already said, doesn't have a corporate view on in or out, neither do we actually have a conclusion on what out should look like. In fact, in this publication, there are four different blueprints put forward. Should we remain a member of the European Economic Area, rejoin EFTA and sort of try to take advantage of some of the existing institutions? Should we pursue free trade via the Commonwealth or in the Anglosphere? Is that where Britain should find its future? Should we actually develop a global free trade association of some sorts in this age of globalisation? Should we prioritise EFTA access and deregulation? The winning entry actually of the IEA Brexit Prize by Ian Mansfield called for a negotiation of membership of EFTA while remaining outside of EEA. So I hope all of these ideas are going to be carefully considered, not just tonight but in the greater debate about the very real possibility of Brexit in the next Parliament. And to do so, we have four men with us this evening who are all of sound market principles, but I'm hoping will strike at least some discordant notes between them. Our first speaker will be Dr. Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Advisor to the Mayor of London and author of the Europe Report, A Win-Win Situation. And in this publication, he states the UK can only achieve serious reform if it's serious about leaving, and it can only be serious about leaving if it believes this is better than the status quo of staying in an unreformed EU. It is, says Dr. Lyons. Our second speaker will be Douglas Carswell, the UKIP Member of Parliament for Clacton. In August, Douglas left the Conservative Party to join UKIP, won the subsequent by-election to become UKIP's first elected Member of Parliament in Westminster, and when defecting to UKIP, Douglas said, "Cameron's not serious. It's a smoke and mirrors referendum. His advisors told me the plan." Our third speaker will be Ron Stewart Brown, the founder and director of the Trade Policy Research Centre which has now established a prominent position in the UK's continuing debate on its trade policy options outside the EU trading framework and counts some 40 leading UK businessmen amongst its supporters. And last but by no means least, David Campbell Bannerman, who is a Conservative member of the European Parliament for the East of England. He was first elected to the European Parliament as a UKIP candidate, but joined the Conservatives in 2011. So we've got one person who's gone from blue to purple and one person who's gone from purple to blue. And in his recently released book entitled Time to Jump, he explores the benefits for Britain leaving the European Union. And we think here at the IA is correct to point out, David says the following: as Mr. Salmon found out to his cost, if you don't have a properly worked out and realistic alternative model, you will not achieve independence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our four panellists this evening. I'll ask each of them to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes. After 6 minutes, I will make a gentle tap with the glass. After 6.5 minutes, I will start making a very loud knock of the glass. And if you've exceeded 7 minutes, well, I'm the person with the jug of water in front of me who can bring things to a very swift conclusion. So thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us. Gerard, we can begin with you. The floor is yours.
Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure, great honour to be here this evening. Mark's already mentioned the report and the outcome of it that I did for the Mayor at the end of last year. But I think, stepping back, I think the key issue for all of us, and indeed whether it's Britain, Europe, etc., is how we position ourselves in what is a changing and a growing global economy. I don't think people really fully yet appreciate the extent to which the world economy is changing. At the end of this year, if the IMF's right, the world economy at the end of this year will have risen to $82 trillion in size. At the year before Lehman Brothers went bust, the world economy was $62 trillion in size. Despite what's happening in the West, the world economy is growing. In fact, the one part of the world economy that is lagging is Europe. And therefore it's vital that Europe does reform. Now the UK needs to be at the forefront of the reform agenda. But if we are here tonight discussing Brexit, it's because we would have had a referendum where the British public would have voted to leave. So the first key issue is the context. And that context where the public has voted to leave is presumably one in which the UK economy is performing better than Europe. Remember, when we voted in the mid-70s to go into the common market, it was then under the perception that Europe had an economic model that would work well in the future. Clearly, that is not the case. Also, at the same time, one would assume that if a referendum votes to leave, then we will not have achieved reform, or maybe the public's decided, despite the reform, we've had enough of it anyway. But also, it's important to stress that the scale of the referendum outcome will clearly influence any post-agenda in terms of the reform we might be able to achieve in terms of discussions with Europe, or in terms of the exit, in terms of the UK versus Europe, which I'll come on to. So if it's 51-49, then another referendum will remain on the agenda. What are the issues? First, we shouldn't underestimate the risks. Basically, leaving anything is going to come with risks. Therefore, when I did a report for the Mayor last November, we try to avoid what most economists do, which is to say what's going to happen if we stay in versus if we leave, and then to do a scenario over 2 or 3 years ahead. It's important to stress that there will be uncertainty ahead of a referendum, uncertainty afterwards. Therefore, what we did was to look at 2 economic cycles, which basically is somewhere between 18 and 20 years. And then we came out with a solution, basically being in a reformed EU was best, but a reformed EU needed to clarify the issue between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone countries. It needed to make sure the single market worked. It needed to stop ever closer union, and it needed to establish the supremacy of UK courts in areas outside of the single market. But very importantly, if we left, and if we left both on good terms and pursued sensible policies here in the UK, that would be far, far, far better than the status quo. The worst scenario would be if we left on very bad terms and basically became inward looking. But the reality is that if we left and were thinking globally, then the UK could do well outside of the EU. What issues came out from that report? Well, very importantly, if we were to leave, then it's vital to have a narrative that not only works in the near term in terms of possible quick wins, but more importantly creates a vision for the future. That vision for the future would be one in which the UK was not only global, open to trade, but also one in which it remained attractive to inward investment, and also very importantly in terms of any debate, ensure that workers' rights were upheld outside the EU. It's not a case of competing solely on cost. The UK needs to compete both on cost and on quality. In terms of issues, 3 sectors of the London economy were most impacted if we were to leave. One was finance and insurance, another was the professional, scientific and technical sector, and another was transport. Therefore, it's important to address issues in those sectors. At the very beginning, Mark was talking about his scenarios and say not getting bogged down in the cost-benefit analysis. Too much of the analysis is very much of that type, but also much of the analysis is focused on the legal complexities, particularly if we were to leave. Indeed, last year Clifford Chance and City UK did a very good analysis, and they basically came to the conclusion that the legal complexities are such that we might as well stay put, whatever the situation. In contrast, I would argue that the report that won the IEA's analysis last year was very pragmatic and suggested that this is new territory and new proposals will be found to address the issues. What are these issues? It's not only the issues affecting those sectors most at risk, shall we say, it's also issues that address such as openness to the European market. We need to make sure we have a clear relationship with the EU in terms of having access to the single market. This is likely to be easier to achieve in terms of the goods area than in terms of services, because the single market doesn't yet work in services, or indeed in terms of finance. But I would stress that in those areas, services, as I say, the single market doesn't yet work. Also, in terms of the area of finance, it's important to stress that one of the big issues worrying people in the city at the moment is that relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone. And the fact that we will never, in my expectation, join the Euro suggests that the city already faces a problem. So it's not plain sailing even if we were to stay in. And many of the issues that people articulate and pinpoint if we were to leave are issues themselves at the moment if we stay in the EU. Trade deals. Leaving versus staying in doesn't make it easier or harder. It just makes it different. At the moment, we take part in trade deals with the EU where we are one of many. If we were to leave, there is a problem in that we don't have that skill set. We would need to develop it. But South Korea and many other countries show medium to relatively large economies can successfully establish trade deals, but they do need to work at it. What we would find easier is the ability to actually have trade deals focused on our area where we want to achieve success. What might be harder is when we deal with people like the US. But let's be frank, the European Union's already finding it pretty hard at the moment. What else is there? The other last issue really is the relationship we have, given the time, between the UK and the European Union. Many people say, should it be a Norwegian deal, should it be a Swiss deal, should it be a Turkish deal? The reality is many of those deals are not really appropriate for the UK. Also, many of the organisations that exist outside, whether it's NAFTA, etc., are not really appropriate for the changing global economy. And one of the areas of the world economy that is changing is policy making and policy organisations. We've gone from G7 to G20. Outside of the EU, we will still be on the permanent membership of the United Nations. We will still have big, powerful weight on global issues. And many of these global fora need to change with the times. So really putting it all together, the reality is that ideally we should try and reform the EU. But if you believe that the EU will not reform, or that reforms that are possible will not be as much as we really want to achieve, then we shouldn't be worried about leaving. But if we do leave, we have to accept that there are considerable near-term risks. But as long as we have a clear strategic vision about outward-looking UK in the global economy, then I think we have less to fear than many suggest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Douglas.
If we weren't members of the European Union already, do you seriously imagine, does anyone seriously imagine that there would be this great clamour that we should join? Does anyone seriously think that if we weren't in the EU today, people would be suggesting that joining would make us more prosperous? If you cast your mind back to the 70s, when the argument was made for us to join, we were told that it was a question of economics, that EU membership would make us more prosperous. Looking across the channel at the ruinous effects of European integration, particularly monetary union, does anyone seriously think that Europe is the way to organise the lives of millions of people? We've joined the only trade bloc around the world that is in decline, and it's in some pretty serious and cataclysmic decline, precisely because of the way that it is internally organised and structured. When we joined it in the 70s, what became the European Union accounted for 36% of global GDP. I think it's about a quarter of global GDP now, and by the mid-2020s it's expected to be about 15% of global GDP. About the only things that are growing in the European Union in terms of the economy are unemployment and debt. And I would argue that it cannot reform itself. The very project, the very European project, explains Europe's sclerosis and economic failure. Now, I think we should leave, but the question of how we leave is absolutely vital and essential. We don't really want to leave the European Union in order to become protectionist, in order to turn our back on anything. We want to leave the European Union in order to be better placed to prosper in the future. And I think that makes it absolutely essential that we make the argument for leaving in terms of global free trade, and that we are prepared to unashamedly champion the cause of global free trade and all that goes with it. We need to be arguing in favour of the free movement of goods, services, and with some caveats, people and capital. If the argument about our EU membership is reduced to an angry debate against Romanian migrants versus trade, the nativist argument will lose, and deservedly so. The argument for leaving the European Union is unquestionably about opening ourselves up to the world. In order to leave successfully, I think we need to overcome various vested interests, and the biggest vested interest of all is the official mind. In government circles, in judicial circles, there are residual assumptions that are 20, 30, 40 years out of date that need to be overcome, and the way to do that, I think, means that you need a free and fair referendum, and you need the mandate directly from the people, from the demos, to overcome the vested interests within the Kratos. We need to invoke Article 50, and then we need to negotiate, and we need to be prepared to negotiate generously as people who want to be good neighbours. I think we've been in an extraordinarily strong position, by the way, to negotiate our exit. We're Germany's largest export market. There's some 50 billion trade deficit that we have with Europe. Well, from their point of view, it's a massive trade surplus. They're not going to want to cut off cross-channel trade, from which they're the principal beneficiaries. I think we need to be able to argue with them, yes, in favour of single market access, but on the basis of real free trade. That means that if it's legal to buy and sell something in this country, it should be legal to buy and sell it in the European member states. But I don't think we should simply limit ourselves to trying to strike those sorts of arrangements with the European Union. We need to, and I go unashamedly for option 3 here, we need to try to build a global free trade movement. And if necessary, we need to be its founding members. It would be better to be in a membership of one than to be in a corporatist trade bloc. We don't want to be like Norway. Norway's, or having said that, Norway does 4.5 times more trade with the European Union from outside the single market than we manage from within. But there's a lot to be said for Norway. But we can do much better than Norway. Norway joined the EU, or this sort of waiting room to join the EU, if you like, and we can get a far better relationship with the European Union than Norway. Do we want to be like Switzerland? Well, I think we can do even better than Switzerland. Switzerland's what, 5, 6, 7 million people? I think we could negotiate an even better relationship with the European Union than Switzerland has. I think we should think seriously about what this country would be like if we scrapped all tariffs. Just imagine if there was no such thing as a tariff. Imagine if we were to enter negotiations with countries around the world and we were to simply say, if it's legal to buy and sell it in Texas, it's legal to buy and sell it in the UK. Why not? why not try that? I suspect that if we did that, we might actually find that we prospered. Now, people argue about the idea of reform, and they talk about, is reform possible? Could we reform? I think people who want to reform the EU and argue that somehow we can stay in and change things, I just don't get it. The single market is not a way of extending free trade. Sure, it uses the language of free trade, but the single market actually means that you can only produce and sell things if you do so in compliance with a standard set of regulations. It has become a vehicle for red tape and regulation. And when people say they want to reform Europe and extend the single market, they talk about extending the ability of bureaucracy to regulate and strangle economic activity. No, we need to be able to have a genuine free trade relationship with the world, including the European Union, and that is not based on the idea of trade requiring permission from officialdom to take place. If we were outside the European Union, we could have lots of free trade agreements, real free trade agreements around the world. And I think that would be incredibly exciting for us. By being in the European Union, we're often told that that gives us more clout to negotiate these relationships, but they never actually seem to happen. We're still waiting for them. It also rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of why trade takes place. Trade doesn't happen because you have a level playing field. Trade happens because it's in the mutual advantage of a buyer and seller in different countries to exchange a product or a service for money. That's why trade happens. You don't need to be a big diplomatic player for that to happen. That explains why Iceland has a free trade agreement with China, why Switzerland has a free trade agreement with China. If we were to leave the European Union and enter genuine free trade arrangements with countries around the world, we wouldn't need big corporatist quota negotiations. We could just strike a free trade agreement. I think that it's absolutely vital that we negotiate good terms of exit, but fundamentally, I think if we were to leave the European Union and prosper, we could be a beacon of hope, not just to tens of millions of Europeans who want to live at peace with their neighbours in Europe, who want a free movement of goods, services, capital, and to some extent people, but who are desperate for a way of doing that doesn't involve having bureaucrats telling us how to live our lives.
Thank you very much. Ronald, and sorry, I should have pointed out at the start, Ronald's helpfully brought along a number of his one-pager on customs unions, which I think we've left in the reception area, so pick up one of these before you leave this evening. Ronald, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, good evening, and thank you, Mark, very much for inviting us to join three such distinguished speakers on the panel this evening. The Trade Policy Research Centre, which I run, is the hearing all right on this? Our strong preference is for the UK to stay in the EU if we can negotiate acceptable terms for continuing membership. But to negotiate effectively, we need to know how to leave the thing. And the prime difficulty we think we face in discussing how to leave is that so few people really have any real grasp of the complex and multidisciplinary world of trade policy. I think really no one should be discussing this subject unless they are familiar with the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system and its agreements which are embodied in this document, which is actually what you call a global free trading movement, and it's been bringing average tariffs in the world down from 20% after the war to 2.5% now. So it's a good thing. And I'd also like to point out, Douglas, that our goods exports to the rest of the world have grown by 35% over the last 5 years, and service exports by 30%. So we are gradually shifting our trade balance to the rest of the world. As I've only got 5 minutes to speak this evening, I'd like to make 7 quick points. First, let's remember that the most fundamental principle of the multilateral trading system is non-discrimination of trade between countries. Only 2 types of preferential trade agreement are allowed between different countries, developed countries, customs unions and free trade areas, and that's what our one-pager is about. In essence, for anyone of goods between them, and common external tariffs against imports from other countries. Of course, the EU is the best known example of that. By contrast, countries forming free trade areas agree to have duty-free trade between them in goods which originate in that free trade area, but they remain free to set their tariffs on imports from other countries. Rules of origin can often be very complex and difficult to comply with, and therefore, in our view, represent often quite a serious impediment to free movement of goods. Somewhere here, if anyone wants to study rules of origin in EU free trade agreements, they can have happy reading this book. I don't recommend it, it's very boring. So let's just look forward to the year 2017 when we make it a referendum. The proportion of UK goods UK exports of goods and services going to the rest of the EU, we reckon will be down to just 37.5%. So the trade case for continuing EU membership is declining quite fast. And furthermore, we reckon that some 2/3 of UK goods exports to the rest of the EU would not be significantly affected if we left the EU without a preferential trade agreement. But some areas would be, particularly cars, food and chemicals, which would face relatively high tariffs if we left the EU without a free trade agreement, which would render them much less competitive in EU markets. That really matters. I should mention that many in the city, and Gerard knows as well, are worried about the position if we gave our position in the single market in financial services and insurance without a preferential trade agreement. In our view, and we've done quite a lot of work on this, these worries have much less substance than organisations like The City UK contend. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to go into that now. Many people argue that if we do leave the EU, we should have a free trade agreement with it like Norway or Switzerland does. And the main advantage of that they see is the ability to negotiate new free trade agreements with other countries in a way which perhaps we couldn't now. But at the TPRC, we question how much economic value is actually delivered by free trade agreements. So often the higher tariff items in countries' trade get excluded from free trade agreements, either by just not being in the agreement or by very demanding rules of origin. Non-tariff barriers aren't well dealt with at all by free trade agreements, and free trade agreements tend to do not much to liberalise trade in services in practice. So at the TPRC, we've concluded that the only practical way for the UK to leave the EU is to negotiate to stay in customs union with it on a new intergovernmental basis, with continuing voting rights, which we call staying in Europe for trade. Maybe in theory a free trade agreement would be better, but in practice, starting where we are now, I think it's an unrealistic option. Let's not let the unattainable best be the enemy of the attainable good. Before ending this brief discourse, I'd just like to summarise the main advantages of our negotiating to stay in customs union with the EU. First, it would safeguard free movement of goods and therefore enable a completely seamless transition from our present single market basis of trade with the EU. Second, we would have the high moral ground with our European friends. They know we don't want political union with them, and our leaving in this way would not in any sense impair the access of their goods and services exports to UK markets, which would not be the case with the free trade agreement. Third, the goods sectors I mentioned, cars, foods and chemicals, would stay secure within the EU's common external tariff band, with continuing free movement of goods, and we need to keep those sectors happy. Fourth, it would eliminate the concerns that people like John Longworth of the British Chambers of Commerce have been expressing about the uncertainties the prospect of a referendum would cause the UK business community and foreign investors. If we negotiate to stay in Europe for trade, as I believe we can, they will all know that the UK leaving the EU in this manner would not in any way change the basis of UK-EU trade. Fifth, it's quite an important point that. Fifth, we would stay within the EU common, the European Customs Union voting structure, which would be of huge importance to Germany and the other free trade-oriented members of the EU, as well as to most countries around the world, starting with the USA, who want at all costs to avoid protectionism. The main legitimate reason that other countries have for being against the UK leaving the EU is the fear that the balance of power on the EU Council of Ministers would swing to instinctively protectionist countries like France, Spain and Italy. And who knows how the Eurozone crisis is. I'm sure someone's got some views on that, but I don't know. But we must keep the European Customs Union together. It's a good thing, and it keeps the protectionist countries under control. Sixth and last, if we left in this way, it would permit the relatively easy adaptation of existing EU free trade agreements with countries like Norway, Switzerland, South Korea and Singapore, so that we could remain party to them. So that's why I recommend staying in Europe for trade in this way is the best way for us to leave the EU, if it ultimately comes to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Last but not least.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me along, and congratulations on the Brexit Prize. I thought that was an excellent initiative to really get this debate going. So thank you for all you've done through IEA. Now, yesterday, you'll probably be glad to know, I had a very good lunch. And this was actually in Taylor's Port in Porto with the chairman, and it was amazing, really, because it was founded in 1692. And the Treaty of Methuen in 1703 meant we reduced tariffs on Portuguese wine and not on French and German wine. And that's eventually what created the port industry. Obviously, it had to be fortified later on. But it does show you, there is an example of an industry with a great British tradition, dare I say, which has been going for hundreds of years without the benefit of the European Union. And I genuinely believe that is there are many, many examples that if we have to leave the EU, it's not the end of the world. It won't mean, as Nick Clegg claims, 3 million jobs will be lost because we won't have any trade. I mean, that is ridiculous. Trade has been going on for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and that will continue. So, how do we leave the EU? You've asked us to touch on that. I do take Doug's point. I think Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, the constitution that they claim wasn't a constitution, but it is a constitution. I think what's attractive about Article 50 is it constitutionally forces the EU to actually agree a withdrawal agreement, as they call it. It's basically, I've looked into this, it's basically a comprehensive trade, economic and political agreement. It's about as comprehensive as you can wish for. And it forces them to do so within 2 years. There's a 2-year window to negotiate it. We have to give notice after a referendum to the Council, and then you have the Commission or the External Action Service that actually then negotiates with us. And then that goes to the European Parliament, and no doubt the French will be difficult, but after a while, Germans will see sense, obviously. Eventually, I believe, we'll get a deal. And I think the point is why? Because we are the largest single trading partner of the other 27 nations. It's a 56 billion deficit in goods that Doug mentioned. Okay, 13 billion pounds in services. I understand that is an argument on the city. But overall, it's a massive deficit, large in some countries in terms of economy. And on the basis of that, would they seriously not give us a trade deal? And even if we don't get a trade deal in that odd scenario, then we go to the default position, which Ronald's touched on, of the World Trade Organization. Now that is bad news for cars. It's 10% tariffs, the WTO default, as I call it. But the reality is, 73% of cars registered on British roads every year are built in the rest of the EU. 73%, nearly 3/4. So who's going to lose this? There's millions, over 1 million Germans are actually employed by the British market to build cars, to build trains, even engineering parts. So I believe that it is crazy to think in terms that the EU would not do a trade deal with us. I speak as someone who's on the European Parliament International Trade Committee. I'm actually responsible for the India Free Trade Agreement. It's not my fault, it's going nowhere, by the way. It just shows you that 7 years, it's gone nowhere. They told me, the ambassador to the EU told me the other day, over another good lunch, that actually, why do we have to deal with the Commission? He said, why can't we deal with nation states? And I thought, well, I'm not leading you on this, but that's where I'm at. But generally, there is that feeling. There's a lot of suspicion about the EU on these regards. And you've got EFTA. New Zealand has had 9 FTAs, free trade agreements, in 10 years. New Zealand, little New Zealand. China has an FTA with Switzerland and Iceland. You know, so the idea that you have to be in this massive trade bloc to get these trade deals, well, in a massive trade blocs, you have to compromise. And you have the French saying, we don't want, you don't want American investment in healthcare. So, TTIP is in trouble. So, I think Article 50 is the way forward. I think it is practical. The next thing then is the model. You know, what do we have afterwards? And this is the nub of it. As Mark rightly said, I was up in Scotland campaigning for 2 weeks, and we saved the right union, in my view, the British Union. But you know what was interesting? There was someone with a 600-page blueprint, and then 3 Plan Bs for the currency. And it didn't wash, and the Scottish people knew it didn't wash, and a lot of big companies up there actually made a huge difference by sort of wading in, Project Fear as it was known. Now we're going to get that in this referendum, Project Fear against us, so we better have a model that is saleable and simple and effective and positive. And I think the question is not what is the best model for Britain. What is the best model for Britain that will win a referendum is actually the question. Because you might have a brilliant model, but it might be too complex to explain to the British people in a referendum. Now what I have put forward is what I call EEA Light. Sits between Norway's 120 bilaterals, it was a bit messy in my view, but very free and democratic, and Norway's EEA agreement, which has a lot of flaws to it, a lot of benefits. It isn't true, as they say, that all your laws will be dictated by the EU with no say and no influence. It's only about 10% of the laws every year, on average, are to do with the single market. They have control of fishing, farming, trade, justice, home affairs, immigration, employment policy, social policy, all these areas that we want back. But there's a problem. There's 2 problems, actually. One is influence, that argument, and one is immigration. Well, on influence, if you leave the single market, then the EU is not dictating 100% of your laws, it's only dictating 8% of your laws, because only 8% of the British economy, the 40% of exports, 40% of 20%, I think I've got my maths right, 8% of the economy is actually trade with the EU. And 5%, as the excellent publication like Business for Britain came up with, only 5% of British businesses trade with the EU. So if you leave the single market, recreate the UK single market, then I think you solve the influence problem. Then on immigration, which is obviously a moot cause, a huge driver of a lot of discontent at the moment, the Swiss had a referendum on mass immigration. They voted against mass immigration, only by 50,000. But the EU is going to have to deal with Switzerland, and we can have a similar arrangement. I think we have to, we keep 3 of the 4 freedoms, goods, services, capital, but the 4th one, freedom of movement, we've got to have quotas. And I think if we have quotas and we leave the single market, then we have a very attractive model, and that's what I call EEA Light. I've got a conference on Wednesday, and you're welcome to come along, though it's actually very full at the moment, but you're welcome to come along. But, ladies and gentlemen, this is a fascinating area. Finally, the final area I would say is, well, what are the issues arising out of this process of leaving the EU and adopting such a model? Well, there is the trade deal issue. In this fact, there's all these EU trade agreements that already exist between the EU and other countries, 53 FTAs roughly. Now, you could just agree with those countries. I'm dealing with Canada here, High Commission. You could just say, look, let's just keep it as it is with the EU, and then let's negotiate another deal. Or you could just take EFTA trade deals, because there isn't one with Singapore, there isn't one with China from the EU. You could do those. That is an issue, that is a challenge certainly, but I think it's all doable. The other thing is, what regulations do you want to get rid of first? Because I think this deregulation process will be enormous. I think it will take 10 years, if not 15 years, but what a benefit. 10 years of deregulation to improve our economy, free up our businesses. Working time directive, it's killing the NHS, these massive payments for doctors and locum nurses and doctors. That could all go. Temporary Workers Directive, Large Combustion Plant Directive, Emissions Directives. I have to say I was speaking to a very large manufacturer of cars last week. who could be put out of business by EU emission directives. And you say, well, is it really worth staying in the market if they're going to put you out of business? So I think there's a lot to be debated on this, but now's the time, and thanks for your interest.
Very good, thank you. We've got the volume on my microphone going up.